The text buzzed in my pocket as I stood at the back of the church, feeling the weight of my uniform settle perfectly on my shoulders. The sharpness of my heels echoed off the marble floors of the chapel, mingling with the whispers of the crowd. It was supposed to be my sister's day, the day she stepped into the future with the man she loved. But here I was, still holding on to a past I couldn't seem to escape. I looked down at the phone screen. "You're wearing that to your sister's wedding? Disgraceful." The word stung even now after all these years. It wasn't just a father's disapproval, it was the culmination of a lifetime of silenced expectations, quiet rejection, and a bitter realization that I would never be good enough for him. I stood there, my breath steady, hands trembling slightly as I read the message once again. It wasn't surprising. It wasn't even painful, not in the way it had been when I was younger. Now, it was just a confirmation of what I had always known: he would never change. But in this moment, surrounded by the people who mattered most to me, I realized something else. I didn't need his approval anymore. I had earned my place and I wouldn't let him take that away. I tucked the phone back into my pocket as I straightened my back, fixing my gaze forward. The doors of the chapel swung open. The music played, soft but strong, filling the room as I began to walk down the aisle. The first step was measured, the second more deliberate. I could hear the soft clink of my boots on the floor, each one a step further from the past, a past that was no longer mine to hold on to. And then, something incredible happened. Just as I reached the halfway point, a loud voice rang out from the crowd. "Admiral on deck." It wasn't the first time I'd been saluted. But today this was different. Today it wasn't just the usual salute for rank. It was a salute for everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed, and most importantly, for the person I had become despite everything. I looked at my father in the crowd. He was there, sitting stiffly at the back, his glass of wine frozen halfway to his lips. His eyes locked with mine for a brief, agonizing moment, and in that silence, everything shifted. His hand shook slightly as the glass slipped from his fingers, spilling red wine across the floor. But it wasn't just his wine that had spilled. It was the illusion he had tried to keep up all these years. I didn't react. I didn't need to. My silence, my composure, was all the answer he would ever get. I had earned this moment. And I wouldn't let him, nor anyone else, ruin it. The sound of the footsteps was deafening in the silence of the chapel. As I moved forward, my mind drifted back to the years that led me here, to this moment where I had to prove, yet again, that I wasn't just my father's disappointment. I had worked so hard to be where I was, not to gain approval from anyone, least of all him, but because I knew my worth. Still, with every step, I could feel the eyes of those who had once doubted me, the weight of expectations pushing down on my shoulders. It wasn't just the uniform I wore today, it was the legacy of my father, the one that defined who I was supposed to be, according to him. Growing up, I had learned to live with his silence. Every accomplishment, every success had been met with indifference or worse, disdain. It wasn't just the words he didn't say, it was the weight of everything he chose not to express. The hugs that never came, the praise I never received, the love that was always hidden behind the mask of duty and tradition. It wasn't until I was older, until I had joined the Navy, that I truly understood what I had been striving for. It wasn't validation from anyone. It was the fight to prove that I could be more than what my father had always seen in me, a failure, a woman who could never live up to his impossible standards. But today, standing at the altar, I realized that this was not about proving him wrong. This was about acknowledging my journey, the sacrifices I had made, and the woman I had become. I had earned my place here, not by following in anyone's footsteps, but by creating my own path. As I walked further down the aisle, I could feel the eyes of my team, my SEALs, on me. Unlike the many who had let me down in the past, they had seen me for who I truly was, strong, capable, and worthy. They stood at attention as I passed, not because they had to, but because they respected me. And in that moment, that respect was everything. The weight of my father's silent judgment was heavy, but the weight of the support from my brothers and sisters in arms was greater. Their salute wasn't just for my title, it was for everything I had fought for and overcome. It was for the strength I had shown in the face of adversity, and for the path I had carved out on my own. My father, sitting in the back, watched silently, his expression unreadable. I knew what he was thinking. He never believed I could get this far, never thought I could rise to this level. But as the ceremony continued and the salutes continued to rise around me, I knew one thing for certain. Today I wasn't just walking toward a man in a suit, I was walking toward a new chapter of my life, one where I no longer needed his approval. As I reached the altar, my fiancé James stood there, calm, understanding, and ever supportive. His eyes met mine, and without saying a word, I knew he saw me, truly saw me, not for the uniform or the medals, but for the woman I had become. The ceremony continued without a hitch, but my mind was racing. The words spoken, the vows exchanged, they were important, but they felt like a distant echo to the battle I had been fighting for years. My father's eyes never left me, but he never stood. He didn't even nod in acknowledgement when 200 men stood at attention to salute me. His silence was as loud as any criticism he had ever given me. It was almost as if he didn't know how to acknowledge the woman I had become. And I couldn't help but think back to those times, those endless years of trying to prove that I was worthy of something. To him. To everyone else. It all started when I was young, in his shadow, constantly chasing approval that never seemed to come. I remembered the first time I told him I wanted to join the Navy. I had been so excited, so full of hope, but he just dismissed it as a phase, something a girl like me shouldn't even think about. "You're too soft for this life," he had said, the words cutting deeper than any physical wound. I'd spent my childhood in a house where medals and uniform creases were a sign of respect, and feelings were treated as distractions. My father's coldness wasn't an accident, it was a doctrine. He believed in honor, duty, and control, but the truth was, he had no room for love, especially not for me. I was always just the daughter who didn't fit the mold. The daughter who would never be enough. But today, as I stood there, in front of my team, in front of James, in front of everyone who truly saw me, I realized how wrong he had been. He had made me feel small for so long, but I had grown, blossomed, and become stronger than I could have ever imagined. And today, my uniform was not just a piece of cloth, it was my truth, and it was all I needed to walk down that aisle. I glanced over at James. He was still standing there, waiting for me as always. In his eyes, there was no disappointment. No judgment. Just love. He had never tried to make me feel like I had to choose between my career and him. He had always believed in me even when I couldn't believe in myself. The ceremony ended and we walked out as husband and wife. The salutes continued, but this time my father's eyes were more focused. I had caught his attention. But it wasn't the kind of attention I had always wanted. It was the kind where he finally saw me for who I had become, but he saw it too late. We made our way to the reception, and James held my hand firmly, guiding me through the sea of congratulations and handshakes. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop thinking about my father, sitting quietly in the corner. He hadn't said a word, and yet I could feel his presence looming over everything. The reception continued in a blur of faces, laughter, and congratulations, but all I could focus on was that one empty seat in the corner of the room where my father sat. His silence felt like a thunderstorm, one that I knew was building but hadn't yet reached its full force. He hadn't come to me after the ceremony, hadn't congratulated me, nor offered any gesture of peace. His presence was a constant reminder of the years of missed opportunities, unspoken words, and disappointments that had defined our relationship. I could see the old, familiar patterns of him, always cold, always distant, never acknowledging anything that didn't meet his strict standards. His silence spoke volumes more than any harsh words ever could. James, on the other hand, stood beside me, ever the rock, supporting me in ways I didn't even need to ask. But still, there was something in my heart that longed for my father's approval, a recognition that could never come. The pain of it was subtle now, buried beneath the surface of everything else I had built, but it was there, lurking, gnawing at me like a forgotten wound. I tried to focus on the people around me, but my mind kept drifting back to that quiet corner where my father sat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. That despite the crowd, the cheers, the salutes, the acknowledgement that I was respected by so many, there was still one person whose approval I was desperate to earn. It wasn't just about proving him wrong. It wasn't about getting a well done from him or even a handshake. It was about finally having him see me, not just as his daughter, but as someone who had earned every bit of what I had accomplished. And I knew that deep down he would never be able to do that. As the evening wore on, the crowd thinned, but the knot in my chest didn't loosen. I had walked down that aisle, head held high, knowing that my uniform symbolized everything I had worked for. But as I stood there in the midst of this celebration, I realized that I wasn't just here for a wedding. I was here to face the truth of my relationship with my father, to come to terms with the fact that I might never get what I had always wanted from him. Acceptance. The night stretched on, and just as the music slowed and the room quieted, my phone buzzed. The familiar ping broke through the haze of my thoughts, and I glanced down. A message from an unknown number, a text I knew all too well. "You're wearing a uniform to your wedding. Disgraceful." I should have expected it. I should have been numb to it by now, but something inside me stirred, a quiet, angry calm that settled deep in my bones. I didn't feel the rage I once would have. Instead, I felt clarity. This wasn't about him anymore. It never had been. I had worked hard to get here to this moment, and no one, least of all him, could take that from me. I tucked the phone away and turned to James, my heart a little heavier but my resolve even stronger. He squeezed my hand, understanding without words. He had always understood me in ways I didn't even understand myself. And that, I realized, was the difference. Where my father saw my achievements as a threat, James saw them as a testament to my strength. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. I wasn't chasing approval anymore. I wasn't trying to win anyone's favor. I had already earned everything I needed. The reception carried on, and I found myself slipping in and out of conversations, but all I could hear was the echo of my father's voice. His words, disgraceful, replayed over and over in my mind. It wasn't just the text, it was everything that had led up to it. All those years of chasing a shadow that would never approve. All those times I had put aside my own dreams, my own desires, just to try and fit into a mold he'd created for me, a mold I would never fit. James noticed my quiet retreat into my thoughts. He always did. His hands found mine again, his thumb gently brushing against the back of my hand. "Hey, you good?" he whispered, his voice calm, grounding me back to reality. I looked up at him and nodded. He knew what was going on in my head without me needing to say a word. He had been with me through thick and thin, always there, never once making me feel less than. But as I glanced at my father again, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe the wedding hadn't just been about celebrating us. It had been a symbolic moment for me, a final stand in a long battle I had never intended to fight but was forced into. A battle between a daughter trying to gain her father's approval and a woman who no longer needed that approval to be whole. Disgraceful, my father's words echoed once more. I felt a surge of emotion, but it wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was more like a slow acceptance. The truth of it all. I had given up years ago on earning his love, his acknowledgement, his respect. And I had done so at the cost of my own sense of self-worth. But now here I stood, surrounded by people who respected me for what I had accomplished, not because of who my father was, but because of who I had become. I could feel it. The weight of legacy was lifting off my shoulders. James saw the shift in me. "It's not about him anymore, is it?" he asked, gently squeezing my hand. "No," I replied, my voice steady, unwavering. "It never really was." As we made our way through the crowd, I could feel the weight of the uniform on my shoulders more than ever before. It wasn't just a symbol of my service, it was the embodiment of my journey. The sacrifices, the hardships, the blood, sweat, and tears. The family I had built with my team, with the men and women who had fought beside me, who had earned their respect not through blood, but through grit, through honor, through actions. The uniform represented everything that I was, everything I had worked for, and everything I had achieved in spite of those who tried to hold me back. My father was still sitting there, watching from the corner, and I could see his face slowly changing, a mixture of disbelief and regret flickering in his eyes. But I didn't need him to change. I didn't need him to say a word. The truth had already been spoken in the salutes of my team, in the eyes of those who had seen me for what I truly was. And as the night wore on, I realized that my victory had already been won. Not through any grand gesture, not through words, but in the quiet, resolute power of just being who I was. The night wore on, and slowly the crowd began to thin, the laughter and chatter fading into the distance. It had been a long day, filled with emotions, filled with moments both joyous and bittersweet. Yet, as I stood at the back of the room watching my father, sitting there silent as ever, my heart remained steady. James had excused himself to speak with some of the guests, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The weight of the evening was not lost on me. The uniforms, the salutes, the people who had stood for me, they all mattered. But the lingering presence of my father still pulled at me. Not because I needed him to validate me, but because the years of longing, the years of silence, had built up in a way that I couldn't easily forget. I stood at the corner of the room, lost in my thoughts, when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to find Marcus Hill, one of my oldest friends, standing there with his hand extended. His face, usually stern, held a softness that didn't match the military uniform he wore. He had always been there for me. Always by my side. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low but comforting. I nodded, trying to keep my composure. "Yeah. It's a lot to take in." Marcus understood. He had seen me go through the same thing over and over again. The push and pull between wanting my father's approval and finally realizing that I didn't need it. But it didn't make the journey easier. "You know," Marcus said quietly, "I don't think your father gets it, but you do. And that's what matters. You've already won." His words hit me like a wave. He was right. I had won. I had come this far not because I sought anyone's approval, but because I had earned my place in this world. I had built my success on my own, fought for my achievements and proven to myself, and everyone around me, that I was worthy. The door to the reception room opened, and I heard the clink of glasses, the murmur of voices. I turned my head slightly and that's when I saw it. My father, still sitting in his corner, but this time his gaze met mine. For the first time in years I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, regret? Or maybe something else. It wasn't the grand gesture I had always wanted. It wasn't a warm embrace, I'm proud of you. It wasn't even a direct acknowledgement. But as I stood there, the silence between us seemed to stretch out, heavy with unspoken words. Then something shifted. Slowly, deliberately, my father stood up. There was no fanfare, no dramatic music. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but there it was, a small, subtle shift in his posture. He straightened his back, adjusted his uniform, and with slow, deliberate steps, walked toward me. I could feel my heart quicken. Was this it? Was he finally going to speak? Was he going to apologize? Or maybe, just maybe, he was going to acknowledge me for who I had become? But no words came. Instead, he stood in front of me, his eyes locking with mine. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he raised his hand and saluted me. The room went still. I stood frozen for a moment, unable to move, unable to breathe. The man who had spent my entire life rejecting me, dismissing me, now stood before me, offering the only form of respect he knew, through the military salute. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, and it certainly wasn't filled with the emotional depth I had once longed for. But it was something. It was recognition. I returned the salute, my hand steady, my heart calm. Not because I was seeking his approval, but because in that moment I understood. This was his way of admitting that he had seen me, that he had acknowledged what I had become. And that was enough. No words needed to be spoken. No explanations. No grand gestures. The silence that followed was louder than any applause, more powerful than any speech. I didn't need my father's approval to know that I had made it. As I turned to walk away, my gaze met James's. He was standing across the room, watching the moment unfold with a soft smile. He knew. He understood. The weight of the years, the struggle for recognition, the fight to prove myself, all of it had led to this. And I realized with a quiet, profound peace, that I didn't need anything more from my father. The respect I had earned from those who mattered was more than enough. The next few weeks were a blur, the wedding already becoming a distant memory, but its impact lingering in the air like a quiet storm. The tension that had built up over the years with my father hadn't disappeared, it still loomed, but there was something different about it now. Something lighter. It was as though the weight of his judgment had finally begun to lift, even if just a little. I could still remember the way his salute had felt, how heavy the air had been, yet how calm I remained. It was a moment of acknowledgement, of respect, but not of love. Not of the kind I had craved all my life. Yet, it was a moment I would carry with me forever. Weeks later I was back at work. The familiar sounds of military life greeted me like an old friend. Marching boots, the clink of gear, the low murmur of commands being given. But something had shifted. The uniform I wore felt different now, more than just a symbol of authority. It was a symbol of my journey, of everything I had fought for, everything I had become. James was with me, of course. As always, he had stood by me when no one else had. His calm demeanor, his ability to love me without needing me to be less than I was, had made all the difference. His understanding was a rare gift, and I cherished it more with each passing day. But the absence of my father's presence still hung over me. The first time I received a message from him, it was unsettling. An email arrived from Navy Personnel Command, but it wasn't the typical business correspondence. It was a request for me to lead a new initiative. They wanted me to take charge of a project, a joint operations initiative designed to overhaul interbranch training protocols and to integrate ethical command leadership practices across the military. It felt like a dream I had once thought impossible. It was an opportunity that spoke directly to my heart, to everything I had built and everything I stood for. I knew I couldn't turn it down. But I also knew it would bring me face to face with old ghosts. I spent hours going over the details of the project. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a high-profile mission. But it was important. It was the kind of work that would make a difference, not just in the military but in the lives of the men and women who wore the same uniform I did. It was the kind of work that could bring about real change. As I stood before my team, preparing to share the new initiative, a sense of purpose filled me. I had always been focused on excellence, on making things better for those around me. This project would be no different. But this time there was something more. It wasn't about proving anything to my father or anyone else. It was about proving to myself that I could lead, not just with strength but with integrity. And yet, despite my resolve, there was still the looming question in the back of my mind: had my father really seen me? Had he understood the person I had become? Would this new initiative be the bridge to the redemption I had been waiting for? Days passed, and soon I was standing at the podium, giving my speech to a room full of military leaders, experts, and dignitaries. It was a room filled with the highest ranks of authority, and yet, the weight of it didn't faze me. I had already carried much heavier burdens. As I spoke about the importance of reform, of leadership grounded in integrity, I caught sight of a familiar face in the back of the room. My father. His presence was undeniable, even from across the room. He had come. He had shown up. And he was watching me. For the first time, there was no dismissiveness, no judgment. There was something else, a quiet recognition. When I finished my speech, the room erupted into applause, but my eyes remained fixed on my father. He hadn't stood when the applause began. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a quiet, deliberate clap. It was my father slowly and silently clapping, not for the rank, not for the uniform, but for me. I didn't need anything more from him. I had done what I set out to do. Not for him, not for anyone else, but for me. The applause that followed felt different this time. It wasn't just a loud roar of approval. It was a wave of respect. Respect earned through years of hard work, sacrifice, and determination. And this time, I didn't need to prove myself to anyone. I had already proven everything I needed to. The days that followed the speech felt surreal. Everything had changed, but nothing had really changed. The approval I had long sought, the acknowledgement I had yearned for, was finally within my grasp, but it wasn't what I had imagined. It wasn't the kind of validation I had expected. It was quieter, more personal. It came not from a room full of strangers, but from my father. From the man who had, for most of my life, been the embodiment of criticism and silence. James and I made our way back to our apartment that evening, the air heavy with the anticipation of something yet to come. I knew deep down that there was more. More to this journey, more to the story of my father and me. But I also knew that it wasn't something I could force. It wasn't something that could be rushed. The following week I received a letter. It wasn't an official military communication, nor was it from Navy Personnel Command. It was from my father. The writing on the envelope was unmistakable, and it sent a wave of emotion through me before I even opened it. I took a moment, sitting quietly at the kitchen table, the letter in my hand, before I finally broke the seal. The words inside were simple but powerful. I watched your speech. I've read your proposals. You've built a career that isn't about proving anyone wrong, including me. You built it to save lives. And I finally see that now. I missed the standing ovation, but I hope I haven't missed my chance to stand beside you, even in a small way. I read it 3 times. The weight of those words sank deep into me. They weren't the words of a proud father, nor were they an apology. They were an acknowledgement. A recognition of the person I had become, not because of him but in spite of him. For a moment I sat still, not knowing how to feel. Part of me wanted to let the anger rise, to feel the sting of everything I had endured. But instead I felt something else. A quiet, powerful peace. That night as I lay in bed next to James, I told him about the letter. He didn't say anything at first. He just listened. But when I finished, he asked, "Do you believe him?" I took a deep breath, considering the question. Do I believe him? No, I said slowly. I don't think he's ready to fully understand. But he's trying. And that's enough for me right now. James smiled, his hand resting gently on mine. That's all we can ask for, right? That they try. The next few months were quieter than I had anticipated. I continued my work, the new initiative taking off and gaining support across multiple branches of the military. The respect I had earned grew every day, not just from my peers, but from the young men and women who looked up to me as a leader. But there was one final piece to the puzzle. The moment I had long imagined, the moment I had waited for. My father standing beside me, not as a superior, not as a critic, but as a man who had finally seen me for who I truly was. One day as I walked into the headquarters for another meeting, I was surprised to find him there. He was standing by the door, his posture straight, his eyes watching me with something different in them, something I hadn't seen in years. Respect. He didn't speak immediately, but as I approached, he took a step forward. His hand moved slowly to his forehead and he saluted me. It wasn't the crisp, perfect military salute. It wasn't the gesture of a proud father or a commanding officer. It was something raw, earnest, a man finally acknowledging the truth. I returned the salute not because he had earned forgiveness, but because, for the first time, I had earned his respect. After a moment of silence, he looked at me and said, "You've done well. Better than I could have ever imagined." I nodded, my throat tight. For once, I didn't need to say anything. The silence spoke volumes. It was a quiet victory, but a victory nonetheless. A victory earned not through confrontation, but through time, patience, and perseverance. The journey had been long and it wasn't over. But for the first time, I felt at peace with the path I had chosen. The road to redemption wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about showing up. About doing the work. And in the end, it wasn't the medals or the rank that mattered. It was the respect I had earned. The months that followed the meeting with my father felt like a slow but steady unraveling of years of tension. My life, my career, my sense of self, they all took on new meanings. The recognition, the respect, the quiet acknowledgement I had always wanted, was now something I had earned, not through any grand gesture or dramatic confrontation, but through consistency, integrity, and leadership. James and I continued to build our life together. He supported me as always, never asking for more than what I was willing to give, and yet, in his eyes, I saw everything I had ever needed. Love, understanding, and a quiet, unwavering belief in who I was. It was with him I realized that I was truly home. As my career flourished, my role expanded. The department I had helped restructure became the gold standard for leadership training, and the systems I had put in place saved lives, provided safety, and created a lasting change. The title, Admiral, became less of a label and more of a symbol of what it meant to lead with empathy, resilience, and above all, honor. Yet as I rose, I couldn't ignore the quiet ache of the past. My father's recognition, as significant as it was, did not change the years of silence between us. But that was okay. I had learned that some things weren't meant to be fixed, only understood. My relationship with him had come full circle, but the work I had done, and continued to do, was what mattered most. One day, out of nowhere, I received a photo. It was from my cousin Claire, who had been at the wedding. The parking lot of the chapel was visible in the background, and in the far distance there stood my father. He was not saluting, not standing tall. He was simply standing there watching. The message from Claire read, "He came, but he still couldn't stand." I sat with that image for a long time. It wasn't the salute I had been waiting for, nor the approval I had yearned for. But it was something. And sometimes that's all you need. A small, quiet moment where the silence between you and the people you care about can begin to heal. As the years passed, my legacy continued to grow, not just within the military but within the families of the men and women I had trained. I received messages from them, from their children. "Thank you for saving my father's life," one young sailor wrote. Another message came from a child named Avery, named after me. These moments, these quiet acknowledgments, were the ones that truly filled my heart. When I received an invitation to deliver a keynote address at the Pentagon about leadership and transformation, it was a moment of full circle. The brass wanted to hear from me not because I was the first woman admiral, but because I had built something meaningful. Standing on that stage, I spoke not of my achievements but of theirs. Of the warriors who followed me not because of my rank but because they trusted me. I spoke of leadership not as a privilege but as a responsibility to always do what is right, even when no one is watching. As I finished my speech, the audience rose to their feet. And, in the back of the room I saw him. My father. He was standing not because he had to but because he wanted to. He had come to the event, quietly, without fanfare. He had come to hear what I had to say. To witness the woman I had become. That was the final moment. The one I had been waiting for, not just for recognition, but for the understanding that I had become something more than his disappointment. I had become my own legacy.